What's up, guys? It's time for another Q&A on September 24th, 2019. It was open this week, so good variety of questions, of course. So I will dive right into them. Mini cut protocol during a bulk. Do you add in cardio, reduce carbs significantly, and replace them with fats in sync with caloric reduction? To improve insulin sensitivity. So, well, really, yeah, I mean, really, you're going to create a deficit one way or another. I would base it off of a few things. Are you eating a lot? Is your digestion taxed? Is your GI taxed? If that's the case, then I'd probably lean towards more caloric reduction than anything else, just because you're also going to be able to give your GI tract a break during that, and that provides some extra additional benefit, along with obviously losing some body fat and resensitizing in terms of insulin sensitivity. So I probably lean towards that. Now, of course, introducing cardio would probably help with insulin sensitivity as well. So I mean, you're not that's not to say that's the wrong way, but in a lot of cases, I'm probably going to reduce calories if the person is eating a pretty significant amount, if they're close to their metabolic ceiling, I guess you could say, just because, like I said, it's going to give their GI tract a break and they're getting some additional benefit from that. So I'm probably going to lean towards that. Now, if they are somebody that just maybe enjoys cardio, then I might add that in for that reason. Or if there's somebody that's not totally capped out on eating, I might do a combination of both. In terms of reducing calories, yeah, I mean, you could reduce carbs and replace with fats, but I mean, just creating a caloric deficit is going to improve insulin sensitivity. We got to remember, insulin resistance can occur in a surplus regardless of macronutrients. I mean, sure, carbs might cause it a little bit more, but fats, I mean, I've seen plenty of people that become insulin resistant on high fat intake as well. So kind of, you could base it off that as well. You could, if you know what the person is going to assimilate better, then you could reduce the opposing macronutrient more, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So take that into consideration. If there's only one PED besides test to run for a contest prep, what would it be and why? Probably a DHT of some kind, probably Masteron. Probably would say that probably because it is going to be not quite as side effect prone as some of the other PEDs. That'll still give a pretty good cosmetic effect, and it'll help balance that testosterone to estrogen or androgen to estrogen ratio alongside the tests. So you could do that, or something like Primobolan would probably work really well, and that also has some anabolic benefit that the mass does not. So you could either one or the other probably be it. Weird one. All right. Every year during my prep, my jaw gets sore and pumped to the point of my cheeks swelling. What the hell is happening? Clenching my jaw more? Certain compounds causing jaw ache and growth? Have you heard of this happening to anyone? Yeah, so just general inflammation and joint swelling and just in some weird areas, things like that, is not super uncommon. Probably not related to any compounds necessarily. Could be related to just literally just lack of recovery, lack of muscular recovery. You got to remember, the muscle, there is muscles in your jaw, they're getting taxed. That's a pretty big muscle. I'm trying to think of what it's called. I think it's the masseter something or other. But yeah, I mean, you're still going to be taxing that muscle. It still has to recover. So, think of it that way. However, could be other things, electrolyte, maybe some type of electrolyte imbalance. Though if it's just isolated to your jaw, it's probably more like a inflammation thing, and the muscle's just worn out, would be my guess. What's funny is I've actually had this happen to me to an extent, and I speculated that it was because I was actually eating the most whole food and trying to cram in as much volume as I could from vegetables and things like that at the end of the prep, and I was chewing a lot, and I was eating very slowly and chewing a lot. I don't know if that's the case here, just because I wanted to kind of savor the food. So is that it? I'm not sure, but again, could be any of those things. Yeah, but that's kind of weird. I don't have an exact diagnosis there for you. Sorry. All right. Best way to establish a good starting dose of lantus. Well, we actually, on the OPD podcast, Joe and I actually just did a whole entire podcast on insulin. It is not out yet. I don't know if it will be out when this video comes out. Maybe, maybe not. But I would probably suggest listening to that. It goes over everything that you could, pretty much everything you're going to want to know in terms of dosages, adjusting dosages, and so on and so forth. So I would just check the link tree in my Instagram bio. You can get a link to the OPD podcast there. Find everything you want to know. So when that comes out, I would suggest giving that a listen. That's going to cover this. But in general, it's really just based on blood sugar. So start low. Nice thing about lantus is you're not really going to mess it up if you start low, and then you can reassess. Usually check fasting blood glucose for the most part. And again, listen to the podcast, you'll figure out why. But even if you wanted to start at 5 units in the morning, you could just start, recheck, and then adjust a couple units or so every time until you find that, the dose that's going to bring your blood glucose down to where you want it to be. Better understanding of the CNS and how it's taxed when constantly training to failure. This was mentioned in your last podcast I listened to. Just wanted to know a little more in depth regarding CNS and bodybuilding. Well, I actually just did a presentation for the Muscle MBA online seminar summit last weekend, and I think if you look up Muscle MBA, you can still access those. There's like a membership, you can get in there and look at all of them. I talked about the autonomic nervous system, and that's a lot of what you're taxing here, because weight training is very sympathetically driven, so your sympathetic nervous system, whereas your resting functions, digestion, and sleep and recovery and all those things are more parasympathetic. So it's pretty easy to see that if you're constantly sympathetically driven or just overly sympathetically driven, then you're going to tax your nervous system too much. Your nervous system branches communicate, so your CNS is mainly brain and spinal cord, but there's other parts of your nervous system that are separate from that. So when I talked about the autonomic nervous system, that is separate. It's involuntary, but through the peripheral nervous system and through these different branches, you're still communicating back up to the CNS, and they talk to each other. So again, if you're too sympathetically driven, then you're going to tax your overall nervous system as a whole, and that's where you'll run into issues. And it's not just bodybuilding. I mean, anyone that's overly stressed in any way, and it can be any stressor. It can be an athlete that's chronically overtrained. It can be anyone, or just a normal person that's too sympathetically driven. You can run into those issues. So, all right, yeah. But I would, if you want to dig into that a lot more, I would suggest going over to the Muscle MBA and checking out that presentation. But talk all about it. So, since that's kind of a broad question, not really like a single question. It's more of a entire podcast topic or something. So what do you do even at low test dosages? You have sensitivity at the receptor, and the nipple is Nolvadex the only option. Low, and I follow up, so low being like a testosterone replacement, 160 milligrams is what they said. So, that's pretty relatively normal testosterone replacement dosage that you might even just be prescribed from a physician. So, so when that gland, if you have glandular tissue there and that gland is sensitive, it's there. I mean, it's always going to be there. You're always going to be susceptible to flare-ups unless you get it removed. But a couple things to consider. So you may just aromatize heavily. Just because your test dose is low doesn't mean you don't have a pretty high aromatase percentage. Like, you don't aromatize heavily. Some people do. And even if your estradiol is normal, you might have sensitivity in that receptor because that estrogen is hitting that receptor site a lot, just because, like I said, it is sensitive. And then also you have multiple estrogens, so you could have an imbalance within your ratio of estrogens, and you could also have some issues metabolizing estrogens. So your liver metabolizes hormones a lot. I have seen people that have normal estradiol and they just aren't metabolizing estrogen efficiently because their liver's gummed up. Maybe they don't have proper bile flow. The bile ducts are gummed up. The liver's not detoxifying, metabolizing hormones properly. So you might look into liver care, focusing on the liver through things like NAC, even bile salts like TUDCA, or increasing your own bile production, perhaps like D-limonene, which I've talked about before. So those things can help. Calcium D-glucarate is a great one to help with overall liver detoxification and hormone metabolism. That's one that you can try. Dosages are going to be all over. I mean, for that, you're looking at 500, 1,000, 1,500. People even go up to 3,000 milligrams for detoxifying purposes. But if you wanted to run that short term as like a detox on the liver, to get everything humming good and metabolizing well, you might even notice a difference there. I've literally added calcium D-glucarate to people's plan that are in a similar situation, and they've had success, and their sensitivity to estrogens, or if that's what you want to call it, has improved. So suggestions for mitigating constipation going into a show for someone who might get blocked up about a week out and remain constipated for the weeks after their last show. Well, first off, you want to, if you can pinpoint what the constipation is from, I mean, that's always going to be best. So is it from changing food sources and lacking fiber? Is it from just too much stress, and you're not forming good bowels? Is it from adding in oral hormones that are gumming up the bile ducts and impacting histamine? What is it from? I mean, I would process of elimination. Look at when did it start, and what did you do around when it started? Did any of those things change? Did stress change? Did foods change? Did hormones change? So I mean, you can maybe identify it that way, and that would help you figure out, okay, yeah, added in oral hormones, it digestion slowed down at that point, and you can address that through things like adding bile salts and more liver support. Maybe it was stress related, you need to fix that. Maybe you have no success with any of it, and you just need to use something that has a mild laxative effect. I mean, yeah, don't really suggest just relying on laxatives, but I mean, if you need to keep yourself cleared out, that is probably going to be a better option than staying all constipated and backed up. So something like, people use super dieters tea a lot, which I believe has senna in it. Senna's laxative. So that's one that you could use just a little bit daily. Keep something like milk and magnesia on hand, which is just magnesium hydroxide, I believe. And it's not like super harsh on the GI, but it'll clean you out here and there when you need it. and you can use those things as needed to keep you cleaned out. Because again, like I said, don't want you to rely on it or want anyone to rely on it, but that's going to be better than staying gummed up and backed up, at least short term. But if you can first identify what the problem is and try to fix that, that's always going to be, that's always going to be better. All right, I think this is the last one. Do you ever use fat loading, and why? Or do you always keep fats low and just vary carb intake? So I'm not sure if they mean fat loading as in fat loading for a contest, or fat loading like a refeed situation. I mean, I can tell you right there, fat doesn't really have really much effect on the hormones that we're trying to improve when we refeed. So like leptin, for example. Now, coming out of even though you're going to come out of a caloric deficit if you add a bunch of fat in, but that's still helpful, but it's not going to be as helpful as refeeding or overfeeding on carbohydrates. So now if you're talking about actually fat loading for a show, then yeah, sure. I mean, you can add fats in to load intramuscular triglycerides. If someone's been on low fats, you can add a little bit of fat in. Some people will do it before they carb load to top those off, and then their carb load tends to work more efficiently because they've already got a little bit fuller look from the fats, and it fills out a little bit of space, and then the carb load tops it off. So they might not need as many carbs to kind of elicit the same visual response, or vice versa. Somebody does carbs first and then they load fats second, because the fat will pull, or the carbs are going to pull more water, and then they can load carbs earlier and then do fats afterwards. So they can make sure that they're coming into the show a little bit drier. But I mean, there's a lot of variables. There's a lot of variables in there, but yeah, I mean, that would be a couple situations where you might. And then in terms of like refeeding, like I said, I really wouldn't do much with fats. It's not going to give you that much benefit. So I think that probably answers the question. All right, that's it, guys. Thanks for tuning in this week, and I will talk to y'all next week.